Okay, so we are going to continue now with our review for the final examination. And before we took a break, we had gotten through the first 8 questions, that is to say, through the questions that had to do with medieval literature, earlier and later. And now we've gotten to question number 9, which is to analyze at least one of Sidney's sonnets to show how he uses the sonnet form, the form of the sonnet, to structure his argument. And remember now, this is a very, very important point. The form of the sonnet, we talked about what a sonnet is. It's a particular kind of poem. Remember, it has a definite number of lines. It can be divided in a number of ways, either into a sestet, or excuse me, an octet, the Petrarchan or Italian form, or into 3 quatrains with a concluding couplet, as in the English quatrains with a concluding couplet, as in the English or Shakespearean form. And the poet who chooses to work within one structure or another is going to structure the argument of the poem using that particular formal pattern. So obviously in the first one, you would have a 2-part argument, right? Whereas in the second case, the English or Shakespearean sonnet, you would actually have a 4-part argument with the 3 quatrains and the concluding couplet. And of course, the way in which we can tell these kinds of divisions is by looking at the rhyme schemes that the different poets will use. In this case, we have Sidney, who is one of the great Elizabethan sonnet writers. And you'll notice that in these sonnets, and I'm talking not only about Sidney here, but also Spenser and Shakespeare, whom we also looked at. And there were dozens and dozens and dozens of other poets who were writing sonnets in the period. And some of you actually have been writing your papers on some of those other sonnet writing poets, the women. And you'll notice that the sonnet generally consists of some kind of an argument, so that it not only has a poetic structure, but it also has a rhetorical structure, because that's what rhetoric is. Remember, we talked about that before. Rhetoric is discovering the best strategies by which to persuade a given audience of some point within a particular context, right? And so you'll notice that in some sonnets, you'll have the male, who is either a lover or a would-be lover, who is courting the lady, and what he's doing, in effect, is presenting her with an argument. You know, here is why you should give me your love. So, or as in Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, we have a case where he is playing with the poetic and rhetorical devices that were used conventionally in many other people's sonnets. And he's making fun of them. But he's making fun of them in a way that ends up complimenting his lady. You know, that even though she is not described with the kinds of conventions that came down from Petrarch and others, nevertheless, she is the most beautiful woman around. She just hasn't been falsely compared with conceits. Okay, any questions about that? All right. 10, show how Spenser uses elements of Neo-Platonism in at least 2 of his poems. Now, you'll recall that we looked at the epithalamion at some length from this point of view, but we also looked at a number of his amoretti, his little love sonnets. And we spent a good deal of time talking about Platonism and Neo-Platonism, the forms that Platonism or Platonic thought took in the Renaissance, we usually refer to as Neo-Platonism, because it was really a revival of the classical tradition of Platonic thought. So what are some of these elements? Well, clearly this would require at least a brief sketch of what the Neoplatonist argument is in his poems, and then illustrating by pointing to some particular lines or images or similes that he employs in his poems. For example, remember in the Epithalamion, the wedding song? He is celebrating the marriage of some young people taking place in a rural setting, in a village. And when the bride comes out, and it's not really a church apparently, but it seems to be a kind of garden path, and she's going to process down that to where she is, of course, going to meet with her soon-to-be husband, and no doubt some officiating person there who's going to bless their marriage. And we have the description of the woman, and notice we describe not only her physical beauties, but also her spiritual beauties, right? The descriptions of her physical beauties are along the lines of the Petrarchan conceits, which by this time had become conventional. But then notice, far more important than her physical beauty is her spiritual beauty. And that's what the poet is most taken with, and that's what he spends most of his emphasis on. Okay, any questions about that? Okay. And this is simply another way of getting at the same kinds of problems as the last couple of questions. Explain the functions of Petrarchan conceits in at least one sonnet by each of the following poets: Sidney, Spenser, and Shakespeare. And what you would want to do is, first of all, talk about what are Petrarchan conceits, and we spent a fair amount of time talking about that. What are Petrarchan conceits? And then what are some examples of Petrarchan conceits in at least one poem by each one of these poets? So that, notice, this obviously overlaps with what we've just been discussing about Sidney and Spenser, but in the case of Shakespeare, notice that Shakespeare can do his own original, as we nowadays would say, spin on things, even to treat these Petrarchan conceits ironically, in order, as he claims, to truly honor his lady love. So notice you'll want to talk about then the functions of the Petrarchan conceits. Not simply identify the Petrarchan conceits, but the functions of the Petrarchan conceits. Is that clear? Any questions? Okay. And then the obligatory question, you know you're going to have to write on this. You will analyze a production of Hamlet as an interpretation of the play, giving at least 3 references to both the film and the text. Now let's just pause there, because this is really a 2-part assignment, isn't it? Okay, so everybody now has seen a production of Hamlet, and you should have been taking notes on it as you were going along, or after you saw it, or rewinding and looking at certain scenes again so that you could get down some of the points that you wanted to make in very specific terms. Because remember now, specificity is all. I do want you to have a grasp of what the problems are in each one of the questions as you answer it. But I also want you to be able to refer very specifically to the text of whatever work it is that you're discussing in your answer. Okay, so a production of Hamlet as an interpretation of the play. We talked a great deal about this when we were talking about Hamlet, that what you have in a textbook is not a play, not really. What you have in your textbook is a script for a play, but a play is only fully realized in production. And when it is realized in production by the director working with the other creative people, the actors, the costume designers, the set designers, the musicians, if there are any, and so on and so on and so on, will be bringing an interpretation, some kind of vision of what the play is about, including some very strong sense of what the different characters are about. What motivates them? Why do they do the things that they do? Okay? And so you'll be doing that, giving at least 3 references. These don't have to be long references. They can be brief references to both the film and the text of the play. Because what you're doing is you're comparing what the film people have done to what Shakespeare provided them with in the script. Okay, everybody understand what I just said? Okay. Then I want you to assume the role of director. You now are the director of the play. Choose a particular scene, whatever it may be. I mean, we've talked about a number of scenes, haven't we? Choose a particular scene and explain how you would direct that scene. See, that's what Zeffirelli did. That's what Olivier did. That's what Branagh did. You know, and various other directors we could talk about. That's what they did, right? Here they are now dealing with a particular scene, and they're having to make decisions. And the director is talking to the actor who's going to play a particular part there. Ophelia in the mad scene, for example. What would you say to Ophelia? Or Ophelia in the hall scene where Polonius and Claudius are going to spy on Ophelia and Hamlet. What would you say to Ophelia? What would you say to the person playing Hamlet? And so forth. How would you set that up? And we talked about how different directors have made different choices. Okay, so how would you direct the scene and give reasons for your decisions according to your interpretation of the function of that scene in the play as a whole? The function of that scene in the play as a whole. Okay? For example, when we talked about the mad scene in Hamlet, we talked about its various functions, didn't we? I mean, it's not just stuck in there because it's, you know, an interesting scene or presents an interesting side of Ophelia's character after the death of her father. Notice there are causes of her madness which are developed in the structure of the play, and there are consequences. And there are consequences. In other words, those scenes don't just exist in isolation. They are connected to other scenes in the overall plotting of the play. Okay? So, once again, of course, you can use the text of Hamlet, which I hope you have with you, unless you have a very extraordinary memory. And that's fine if you do. I'm delighted for you. But most of us would feel much more comfortable having the book at hand to be able to make direct reference to it. Okay, are there any questions about what's required in that part of the examination? Yeah.
Does direct reference necessarily entail a direct quotation, or can we more or less say the scene in which Claudius and Hamlet interact in this way?
Okay, the latter of what you just said. For you to quote something is really not a very good use of your time. Remember, you don't have a whole lot of time. You've got enough time to write your essays, but you don't have a whole lot of time. So you can't just, start copying down extensive passages from the text, because that would take you a long time that could be better spent on actually analyzing what's going on in the text. So yes, you can simply refer to something and say, as when Polonius is giving his sage, but really rather pompous and even foolish advice to Laertes, when Laertes is going back to university in Paris. And you are assuming an audience that is familiar with the play, okay? I am familiar with the play. You don't have to tell me the plot of the play. You can simply make reference to a character, a scene, a situation, the development of a theme, and so forth, and I know what you're talking about as long as you're specific enough in making your reference. An example is what I just said. Or Polonius presenting Hamlet's letter to Ophelia, to Claudius and Gertrude, right? That's a very specific reference. I know what you're talking about then. Okay, yes, a question in the back.
Is that the case for all of the questions?
That's the case with all of the questions.
Thank you.
Now, in some cases where you're talking maybe about a Petrarchan conceit, you actually just want to give it. Lips like coral, and put quotes around it. Eyes like suns. Those were conventional conceits, made famous by the Italian poet Petrarch, but they're used by lots and lots and lots of different poets in different variations. So yes, does that answer your question? Okay. If you want to cite line number, that's fine. If you're talking about, say, Hamlet, and you say in Act 3, Scene 2, such and such happens, or in Act 3, Scene 2, lines 43 through 47. I mean, I'm just making these numbers up for the illustration. I'm not looking at a text now. The following happens. Okay? Also, don't spend a lot of time just, summarizing the plot. Okay? You can assume, in this case, that your reader is familiar with the plot of the play. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have to refer to specific things in the plot, but you don't have to just retell the story. Okay? Is that clear? Okay. I'm going to jump ahead. When we deal with prose works, because different people are dealing with different editions, and the pagination in one edition may be different from the pagination. Then I can go and I can see the specific passage you're referring to. With poetry, you don't have that problem, including poetic drama like Shakespeare, because you actually have line numbers, and the line numbers are not going to shift from one edition to another. Okay. And then moving right along here to question number 13, we have Donne's play with what were called metaphysical conceits in at least 2 of his poems. What's a metaphysical conceit? What's a reasonable definition of a metaphysical conceit? We actually talked about that at some length, didn't we? What is a See how you have to proceed strategically in answering these questions? In some cases, you have to define what the key term is in the first place. In this case, a metaphysical conceit. And then, having defined it, and I'm just talking about a sentence or 2, by the way. You don't have to go on at great length. You're not writing a PhD dissertation here. Okay? Give me a definition in a couple of sentences, and then get right into talking about a couple of his poems and just illustrating. You don't have to go through every line in the poem, but just give an illustration of what those metaphysical conceits are and how they exemplify the definition that you have given. Okay? And we saw quite a number of his poems here in class. Now notice when I go over these things in class, I tend to go very frequently line by line by line by line by line, especially Milton questions. We spent a lot of time talking about Milton, didn't we? And not just about Milton, but talking about Parudise Lost. And you'll remember one of the points that I raised is a classic critical question. And that is Satan's heroism, and you'd want to present some specific evidence of Satan's heroism in Parudise Lost, and then explain the problem it creates for Milton and how he seeks to resolve it. Now notice this is a 3-part question, isn't it? Okay, not just grammatically, but logically, this is a 3-part question. So you have to begin by presenting evidence in Parudise Lost by referring to specific passages. Again, you don't have to write pages on that, but you can refer, quite economically to certain passage or passages in which you find evidence for Satan's heroic treatment. And then 2, explain the problem this creates for Milton. We talked a lot about that. And then how does Milton seek to resolve it? And we talked about that too here in class. And again, you'll want to refer to specific things in Parudise Lost. Now, Parudise Lost is a long poem, and you don't have to discuss everything in Parudise Lost in order to answer the 3 questions contained between those identities, right? So we're not simply talking about how Milton represents the masculinity of Adam and the femininity of Eve, but how he presents those in relation to each other. Okay? That's a key part of this question. Now notice what I'm talking about in many cases is I'm talking about the difference between an A answer and a B answer and a C answer. Okay? An A answer in this case would not only show the ways in which Milton represents gender identities, but how those are presented in relation to each other. A B or C answer might just answer the first part of that, without ever getting down to how that implies for Milton certain kinds of relations between the genders. And then explain their function, that is to say, the function of these gender identities in relation to one another in both the fall and the prophecy of redemption. Both the fall and the prophecy of redemption. Okay? and the prophecy of... Any questions about what I've just been saying? Okay. Then we're moving on into the Enlightenment or Age of Reason. We've been dealing with the Renaissance or early modern period, and Milton is usually studied in courses of this kind and in histories of English literature as the last of the great Renaissance poets or writers in general, certainly in the English language. Even though chronologically some of his work overlaps with the earlier stages of what we have defined as the Age of Reason. Okay, so explain how Bacon, Pope, and Swift, all premier figures in England and in English literature for the Age of Reason, how they exemplify various aspects of the Enlightenment or Age of Reason. And of course, you know I'm going to say something about making specific references to their works. Okay, take those up in terms of, yes, there is some cultural movement that we call the Age of Reason, the term that's usually used in the English-speaking world. On the continent, as I've said, the usual term is the Enlightenment, or its various terms in French and German and Italian and so forth, Spanish and whatnot. Okay, Bacon. We talked a lot about Bacon and scientific revolution, right? Bacon was not himself a scientist, certainly wasn't a major scientist. He, you know, like many people, had a kind of amateur's interest in science. And as an educated and intelligent man, he was very interested in what science would have to tell us, not simply about this fact or that fact, but what science would have to tell us about the methods by which we might inquire into the truth of things. How do we know what we know, and how do we know that what we know, actual history, literary history, and so forth, that human beings are animals who are capable of reason, but they don't necessarily live out that promise of rationality, and frequently don't. So what are the different forms of rationality and irrationality according to Swift? Okay. So now this breaks it down. See, in the previous question, you were being asked to deal more generally with the Age of Reason and different characteristics thereof by specific reference to three major writers of the period. Here now this is broken down. So here I'm asking you to define at least two of Bacon's idols and explain how, in his view, they inhibit enlightened reasoning and progress. Okay, again, notice how the questions have parts. So that here this is really a two-part question, isn't it? So I want you, first of all, to say, okay, here are at least a couple of the idols. What are they? Right? So you want to define them. And then explain how, in Bacon's view at least, these block or distort or inhibit enlightened reasoning and progress toward truth. Okay? Then 18. Coming back to something more specifically literary, describe some specific uses of the mock heroic form in both Macflecknoe and the Rape of the Lock. Now notice, once again, this is really logically a two-part question, isn't it? First, you've got to define and explain what is meant by the term mock heroic, which remember is equivalent to mock epic, which makes it a little easier to deal with because most people more readily think about the conventions of the epic than they might of heroic poetry, though the terms are usually used more or less interchangeably by literary scholars and critics. Okay, so first of all, what is the mock heroic or mock epic? What does it do? What are its characteristics? How does it function? Okay? And then, and also what's the point of it? Why mock something in a heroic or epic form? What's the effect of that? Particularly as compared with other ways of carrying out satire. So, and then of course, the second part of that question is part 2A, is to talk about specific uses of the mock heroic in Macflecknoe, and 2B would be specific uses of the mock heroic form in The Rape of the Lock. And once again, you do not have to refer to all of the examples that you could refer to in those two poems. Just pick out one or two and use those as illustrative of what you find there. Okay? Any questions about that? All right. Analyze Pope's rhetorical maneuvers for dealing with the problem of evil in at least two passages of his essay on man. Okay, now, you will recall, as I said just a moment ago, that we spent a great deal of time on the essay on man, at least the portion of the essay on man that we took up, Epistle 1 and the beginning of Epistle 2. Now, first of all, once again, this is a two-part question, isn't it? You have to explain what is meant by the problem of evil. What is he addressing? He tells us at the very beginning, just as Milton had told us at the very beginning of Parudise Lost, that that's what he's dealing with. Right? In a sense, both Milton and Pope are dealing with the same general or philosophical question. The problem of evil. Well, what does that mean? And both of them say at the beginning of their poems that they are writing in order to, remember now this is an argument, each one is writing an argument. Parudise Lost is an argument. A very complex argument, but it's an argument. And the essay on man is an argument, which is also a very complex argument consisting of various subsidiary arguments. So once again, they are rhetorical, because that's what we mean by rhetorical, isn't it? And the strategies being employed are rhetorical strategies, or here I use the word maneuvers. Okay, so you deal with the problem of evil. What is it? You know, what is the problem, at least in terms of how Pope is addressing it? What is its significance? And then look in detail at a couple of passages, and we looked at many passages here in class in great detail. Look in detail at a couple of passages in Pope's poem and say, okay, see how he is maneuvering. This is why he brings this up the way he does. It's in order to answer such and such kind of objection, let's say. You know how sometimes when people are constructing an argument, they will say something and you wonder at first, well, why is the person saying that? Well, the person is supposing is supposing that there's going to be a certain kind of objection to whatever is being proposed. And so the person is already meeting that objection. That's a common rhetorical strategy or maneuver. So, not only what is he doing in the passage, but why is he doing it? That, once again, would be the difference between an A answer and a B or C answer. Okay? Moving right along toward the conclusion of all this. Number 20, analyze specific rhetorical strategies that Swift uses in Gulliver's Travels, Part 4, to defamiliarize values, ideas, institutions, and practices commonly accepted in his culture. Okay? Now, what is the key to answering this question? Obviously, the key is, first of all, to be able to say what you mean by the term defamiliarizes. What on earth does that clumpy, awkward-looking term mean? And we talked about that at some length, didn't we? It was a term that was originally coined in Russian. That's actually a translation from the Russian. A term originally coined in Russian by a group of then young literary scholars and critics around World War I, just right before World War I, during World War I, right after World War I, when they were universities. I mean, they were people like you. They were college students. And in arguing about literature and trying to figure out certain things going on in literature, especially the literature that was emerging at that time, which was modernist literature, they coined the term defamiliarizing. Well, what on earth does that mean? Well, we talked about that in terms of how we can go along and we can regard certain things as so much taken for granted and to be taken for granted that they seem to be perfectly natural to us. And so it never occurs to us that they could possibly be a problem, or if we recognize them as a problem, that we could do anything about it. But what happens then if you render those ideas, beliefs, convictions, institutions, practices, and so forth in an unfamiliar way so that people see them anew and understand them in a new way, so that then they can begin actually to think about how strange or odd the commonplace really is. And then begin to try to think about ways to change it. To change it. And I gave you a number of examples. I mean, look, for example, at that passage having to do with colonization. As I mentioned when we were discussing that, every country, well, not every country, but virtually every country in Europe, and certainly every major Western country in Europe, was dashing all over the globe trying to establish colonies here, there, and everywhere. And the countries that were a little late in the game were extremely frustrated by it, and they were getting into the business of colonizing because they were saying, we can't be left behind. We can't be considered a major power unless we have colonies. And so they'd go and invade some African country or some part of Asia or Latin America and so forth, or take over some islands in the Pacific. And that was simply considered the way things were. That's the way major powers were supposed to behave. And there were a few people who, like Swift, actually began to question that and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? What are we really doing? What is this thing that we call colonizing? When we look at the realities of it. So what he does is he finds a way of rendering something that people might take as commonplace and natural and even desirable, to defamiliarize it so that people could see it in a new way, and perhaps, if they're people of conscience, begin to do something toward changing it. Okay. And that's something we talk a lot more about in the follow-up course on this when we talk about modernism, because a lot of modernism does exactly that sort of thing. Okay, so you will want to look at some specific strategies in which he does this, and that will necessitate your making some very specific references to the text if you're dealing with this question. Okay? And then, of course, one of my favorites, one of my personal favorites, you know, there's even a T-shirt. I should point out, you know, if you have a chance, you know, grab it up. There's even a T-shirt one of my daughters found for me that has those wonderful lines in a modest proposal, the actual proposal to take children and turn them into a roast or a ragout. So anyway, and of course, then all of your literary friends will know exactly what this refers to. Okay, so once again, rhetorical functions. Rhetorical functions of what, though? Of the authorial persona. What on earth is that? What on earth is that? The authorial persona? Okay, so we look at a modest proposal, and it's a pretty obvious instance of something that we're going to find a lot of in modern and modernist literature. And that is the creation by an author of a persona from which the author may distance herself or himself. And the very creation of that persona is serving some rhetorical function or functions. Okay? So in a modest proposal, you don't have to spend all of the time that I spent talking about the context in which Swift was writing this, which of course was not only Irish history in the 17th and early 18th centuries, but specifically the relations between England and Ireland in the 17th and early 18th centuries. And then, of course, you might at least consider the fact that Swift was writing in the context of very, very, very great controversy. And so he uses the strategy he does as a way of shocking people. He wants to shock people into an awareness that what they are already doing is not a far cry from what he is so modestly proposing here in his essay. Okay? I mean, that's a very important part of what's going on here. The value of shock. The value of shock. The rhetorical function of shock. Okay? Remember also something that I said when we were talking about this, that the term persona does not simply translate into our English word person, much less our English word personality. Persona was the term that was used in ancient times to designate the role that an actor played in a play. and in particular was used for the mask that the actor would wear when the actor adopted a particular role in a particular play. Okay, and then the last question is number 22. Explain some specific ways that Gray and Goldsmith were creating new openings for English poetry in the latter part of the 18th century. Now, there are lots of poets writing in the latter part of the 18th century, and many of them are carrying on the traditions that we've already been talking about. And so it didn't seem to me a particularly useful thing for us simply to look at more or less the same. And I wanted to show you that something new was beginning to come into English consciousness, English cultural attitudes, and therefore into English literature. And so notice that we talked about how both of these poets were emphasizing the common people and the value of common people, especially living in rural settings, out there in the countryside, the very kinds of people that the very well-educated and very powerful, and by worldly terms, very successful people would be condescending towards. I mean, look at those country hicks out there. Okay? But here the whole point is that these are the real people and who have real values and important values. And what's happening? We are destroying the infrastructure for their kind of life by things such as the Enclosure Acts and so forth, so that it becomes now economically impossible for small farmers, small peasant farmers to live any longer in these rural settings. So what happens? They are either driven into the cities where there's really no useful place for them, even to make a living, or they're driven abroad to the newfound colonies. But in either case, notice this is going to lead for Goldsmith to the deserted village. Now, these are themes that are going to be taken up by poets like Blake and Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley and so forth, the great English Romantic poets, or over here in North America by the writers who are known as the American Transcendentalists, Thoreau, Emerson, and the like. American Transcendentalists are simply the American versions of the English Romantics. So, as we come to the end of the course then, I want you to be considering how already we're not simply at an ending, but at a new beginning. And it's this new beginning we'll be exploring in the second course.